Thank you for coming. I know there's a very exciting talk next door, so I really appreciate. What do you do when you're faced with a contradiction that your logical processes have brought you to? I think the sensible thing to do when you're faced with a contradiction, I mean, every theory that is naturally evolving is going to be faced with challenges. But after a certain point, when your paradoxes are starting to stack up, maybe your theory needs a revision, and it's time to check your premises. So you might want to take a trace back through the way you got to your conclusion and figure out where you made an error. You might find some kind of erroneous assumption or generalization, or maybe you made a misattribution of causality. And this is the point where you get to learn something. Of course, changing our assumptions is never very comfortable because they don't stand in isolation. The more you've thought about a particular belief, the more they are bound up with other assumptions that you have. And so then if you take back that assumption, you might have a terrible cascade that in the worst case could wipe out an entire worldview. And you can look at that as some kind of creative destruction like a fire, or it could be a threat to avoid at all costs. And then your strategy might be to ignore it or minimize it. And I'm as fallible as everybody else. So it's really important that we have a community like this with a lot of intelligent people with different assumptions, because it's a lot easier for me to explore what would happen if your assumption is wrong than it is to explore what would happen if my assumption is wrong, and vice versa. So we've got to help each other out. These graphics were distributed widely a few years ago, and they come from a study by Kara Ebeling and others in association with the Boston Children's Hospital, which is associated with Harvard. It was from a study that was published in the American Journal of Medicine, and so it's a very prestigious group with clout, and what they say matters. And so apparently one of the things that they're saying is that low-carb diets and low-fat diets consist of things you can't eat, which makes compliance hard. The reason that they were studying these three diets is that they wanted to see their different effects on metabolic syndrome. And so they found that each of these diets had a substantially different effect on metabolic syndrome. And the low-carb diet clearly had the best results, but they didn't recommend the low-carb diet. They recommended the low-glycemic diet. I don't know, someone pointed out to me that traffic signals use red and green, which are 10% of males can't tell the difference between. But what we have is four green lights at the top. The low-fat diet has 3 red lights and an amber, and then low-carb has this mix, green, red, amber, amber. And so I was surprised at this. Why would they do this switch, and stated so strongly? So I looked back at the paper and I was really distressed, because it was hard to figure out how the translation between the data in the paper and the communications on the graphic could be so different without concluding some kind of systemic bias. I won't go into all the metrics, but for example, we've got a point here for hunger. Each of the different traffic light colors is represented, but when they measured subjective hunger in the different diets, they didn't vary with statistical significance. In the low carb in particular, they have this red light that has 2 parts. It says stress and inflammation. And the part that inflammation was based on was C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein was lower than baseline in all 3 diets. It was less lower in the low carb diet than it was in the low glycemic diet, but low glycemic gets green and low carb gets red. If they were going to be totally consistent, then since the low carb diet had the better effect on metabolic syndrome and the low glycemic was affected less, you might think that